Millionaire tried to humiliate his maid. The truth shattered the room. The mansion on the hill was more than just a house. It was a fortress of wealth, arrogance, and untouchable privilege. Owned by Victor Harrington, a self-made millionaire who adored reminding people that he had climbed the ladder on his own, the estate had become a symbol of his towering ego as much as his success. Every party he hosted wasn't just a gathering. It was a performance, a chance for him to parade his wealth and prove his superiority over anyone who dared step inside his polished marble halls. Victor had an unusual fondness for humiliating others. Waiters, staff, even business associates were fair game if it meant drawing laughter from his elite guests. To him, respect was something earned only by having money. And if you didn't have money, you weren't worthy of it. On one particular evening, the house was lit brighter than usual. Chandeliers glowed like golden suns above a grand ballroom filled with high society. Guests in gowns and tuxedos floated through the room with champagne glasses, laughter bouncing off marble pillars. A string quartet played softly in the background, though their elegant notes were often drowned out by Victor's booming laugh. He was in his element, towering above others, commanding the room like a king on his throne. But in the shadows of that grandeur moved Maria. She was the quiet maid, small in stature, her uniform crisp, her head always slightly bowed. She'd been working for the Harrington family for just under a year, mostly ignored, sometimes mocked. To the guests, she was invisible. To Victor, she was another reminder of people beneath him, people who existed only to serve. Maria's face carried both softness and something else, something that unsettled those who looked closely. Her eyes were sharp, thoughtful, as though she were constantly listening, constantly absorbing more than she let on. But no one noticed. To them, she was only a maid, background noise to their champagne-fueled conversations. That night, Victor decided he wanted to be the center of attention in a new way. He bragged to a group of guests about his vast travels, his business deals abroad, his international reach. He mocked how most Americans can barely speak one language, let alone two. The group laughed politely, eager to stay in his good graces. Then his eyes landed on Maria, quietly setting down a tray of hors d'oeuvres. A cruel smile tugged at his lips. He knew the room was watching. He loved a spectacle. And he loved a victim. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor boomed, his voice rising above the music. The room hushed, eyes turning toward him. He raised a glass of wine dramatically. "Let's have a bit of fun tonight. A game, if you will." His gaze sharpened on Maria, like a hunter singling out prey. "This here, our maid. Do you think she can do what my Ivy League staff can't?" The crowd chuckled nervously, unsure where this was going. Maria froze, her hand tightening around the silver tray. She had been in situations like this before. Humiliation at Victor's expense was almost a ritual at these gatherings. Victor waved over a business partner who had just returned from Japan. The man carried a set of documents, written entirely in kanji. "Here," Victor announced, snatching the papers dramatically. "I bet none of you could translate this. Not even my lawyers. But let's see if our maid here can." He gestured mockingly to Maria, who stood quietly in her corner. The crowd erupted with laughter. Some looked uneasy, others smirked knowingly. It wasn't about translation. It was about power, about forcing someone with no standing to stumble, to fail, to remind her of her place. And then Victor added the final humiliation, his voice dripping with arrogance. "If you can translate this perfectly, Maria, my entire annual salary is yours." Gasps, chuckles, and disbelief rippled across the room. Everyone knew what Victor made. Millions. He threw the papers onto the table, like tossing scraps to a dog. His guests leaned in, eager for the spectacle. They expected her to stammer, to fail, to flush red with embarrassment. But Maria didn't flinch. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, her face calm. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the paper, but her eyes moved with a kind of steady confidence. For the first time that evening, Victor's laugh faltered. The maid who was supposed to be invisible had just stepped into the center of the stage. And when she opened her mouth, the room would never be the same again. The ballroom had always been Victor Harrington's domain. Every chandelier sparkle, every polished marble tile, every glass of imported champagne, served under his roof was part of a grand stage where he performed his favorite act, domination. He relished humiliating those beneath him because it reinforced his illusion of superiority. But now, as Maria stood silently holding the Japanese document. The atmosphere began to shift. The crowd leaned in, expecting awkward silence or at best a few butchered attempts at pronunciation. Their laughter bubbled in their throats, ready to erupt. Victor himself smirked, swirling his wine with casual arrogance. To him, this was already over. He had orchestrated another humiliation, another evening where his cruelty would become legend. But then Maria began to read. Her voice was steady, low but clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. At first, the guests froze, uncertain of what they were hearing. She didn't just stumble through the words, she pronounced them with precision, rhythm, and a fluency that made the foreign syllables sound natural, alive. Her tone carried respect for the language, each word falling into place as though she had spoken it all her life. The laughter died instantly. Champagne glasses hovered midair. Even the string quartet, sensing something unusual, faltered on their notes. One by one, heads tilted, brows furrowed, and disbelief set in. Victor's smirk twitched. He leaned forward slightly, wine glass forgotten in his hand. Surely she was repeating something she had memorized. Perhaps she had seen this exact document before. Perhaps one of his staff had whispered clues. That had to be it. But then she did something that obliterated his excuse. She stopped reading and began to translate. Word by word, line by line. She unraveled the dense legal text, descriptions of a contract, clauses about partnership rights, ownership stakes, penalties, and obligations. She didn't stumble. She didn't guess. Her English translation was seamless, precise, and carried the weight of someone who not only understood the words but also the cultural context behind them. Gasps broke out around the room. A few guests leaned closer, whispering to one another. Some had dabbled in Japanese themselves during business trips, enough to recognize that Maria wasn't just close, she was flawless. Victor's jaw clenched. His laugh had disappeared. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass until it threatened to snap. Maria, meanwhile, stood taller with each sentence. She had been invisible moments ago, the maid whose presence barely registered beyond the tray she carried. Now every eye in the ballroom was locked on her, every ounce of attention pulled by the magnetic power of her knowledge. The humiliation Victor had scripted had flipped, and it was only beginning. The silence grew heavier with each word she spoke. By the time she reached the end of the document, translating the final clause about financial penalties, the room was so still that even the chandeliers seemed to hum in anticipation. Then she gently folded the paper, placed it back on the table, and looked directly at Victor. Not with arrogance, not with a smirk like his. Her gaze was calm, unshaken, almost serene. That quiet strength made the moment even more devastating. Victor tried to recover. His booming voice returned, though it cracked ever so slightly under the weight of his anger. "Well," he barked, "you probably rehearsed that. There's no way." But before he could finish, Maria spoke again. She switched effortlessly into another language. This time it was French. Elegant, flowing sentences, spoken with the confidence of a native speaker. The business associate who had just returned from Paris nearly dropped his champagne flute in shock. He whispered to the person beside him, She's perfect. No American speaks French like that unless they've lived there for years." Victor's face reddened. Then Maria shifted again, this time into Mandarin Chinese. The tonal precision was unmistakable. A guest who ran an import business from Shanghai clutched his chest, shaking his head in disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. "That's not just conversational. She's advanced." Language after language flowed from Maria's lips. Spanish, Russian, Arabic. She moved between them like a dancer gliding across a stage. Each step flawless, each movement designed to stun her audience into silence. By the time she paused, the room was trembling with awe. No one dared laugh. No one dared speak. The power dynamic had inverted completely. The maid was no longer invisible. She was extraordinary, radiant in a way no one in that room could ignore. Victor's carefully crafted world cracked in that instant. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of admiration. He wasn't the one commanding respect. Instead, he was the fool, who had just promised his entire salary in exchange for something he believed impossible. and the impossible had just unfolded right before his eyes. The whispers grew into a storm around the ballroom. Who was this maid really? How did she know so many languages? Why was she here, cleaning Victor's floors, when she clearly belonged somewhere far beyond his reach? But only Maria knew the truth. And as Victor's face contorted with rage, she knew the night was far from over. This was not just about languages. This was about power, and Victor was about to lose far more than his pride. The stunned ballroom erupted into hushed murmurs, disbelief painting every face. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering theories about the maid, who had just commanded the floor. With the poise of a scholar. How many languages had she just spoken? 5. 6. The count didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the undeniable truth that Maria, the maid Victor had tried to humiliate, was far from ordinary. Victor's ego, however, refused to surrender so easily. He slammed his glass down on the nearest table, his eyes narrowing as he studied Maria. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim control, but something about her gaze unnerved him. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't smug. She wasn't afraid. That composure came from somewhere, some life, some history that no one in that ballroom understood. And that was when Maria's story began to unravel, not through her words, but through the whispers of those who thought they recognized her. A woman near the back gasped. "I know her," she murmured, clutching her pearls. Her husband looked at her, startled. "Years ago, in Geneva. She was at the United Nations. I'm sure of it." The ripple of recognition spread like wildfire. Faces that had once looked down on her with disdain now studied her with unease. Maria had always moved silently through Victor's mansion, invisible in her black uniform, her head bowed. But in reality, she carried a past far larger than the glittering room itself. Years before she donned the apron of a housemaid, Maria had stood behind podiums, not trays. She had been a translator at some of the most sensitive negotiations in the world. Summits where words weren't just sentences, but weapons. In halls filled with presidents, prime ministers, and generals. She had bridged languages that carried centuries of conflict. Her memory was sharp, her ear unmatched. Entire peace agreements had hinged on her ability to ensure that not a single word was misunderstood. But politics is never kind to those who hold secrets. One night, in a closed-door negotiation between two rival nations, Maria uncovered more than just words. Buried in the fine print of a trade treaty, she found clauses that suggested corruption, deals dripping in blood money, and secret contracts tied to weapon sales. She had seen enough to understand that powerful men like Victor Harrington, were willing to gamble lives for profit. Her discovery made her dangerous. The threats began quietly, anonymous letters, a shadow trailing her home. Then came louder warnings. A car that followed her for blocks. A phone call where silence lingered too long before the click. Maria realized she was no longer safe in the world of power. To survive, she disappeared. And that was how she became a maid in Victor's mansion. It was the perfect disguise. Hidden in plain sight. Surrounded by wealth but never seen as anything more than the help. She traded podiums for mops, treaties for trays. It was humiliating, yes, but it was survival. No one suspected the maid dusting crystal. Vases had once spoken into the ears of presidents. But now, with Victor's cruelty, her secret was unraveling. Victor himself didn't know her history, but he could feel it. Something inside him told him this woman was far more dangerous than he had imagined. For years, he had dealt with boardrooms, lawyers, and political puppets. But Maria's calm confidence reminded him of the rare few who couldn't be bought or broken. And that terrified him. As the whispers spread across the ballroom, Maria stood still, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could almost feel her old life clawing its way back into the light. The guests were no longer looking at her as a maid. They were seeing her as a mystery, a puzzle they needed to solve. Victor tried to regain ground. He barked about contracts, about money, about how ridiculous it was to believe that a maid had once stood at the United Nations. He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked under the weight of his panic. For the first time in years, his authority was slipping through his fingers. Maria remained silent. She didn't need to defend herself. The room was doing it for her. Every guest's astonishment was another nail in the coffin of Victor's pride. And then, as if fate wanted to seal the moment, an older man near the front of the room spoke aloud. He had been a diplomat once, a representative in negotiations Maria had translated for years ago. His voice carried authority, and his words cut the silence. She's not a maid. She's Maria Santos, the linguist who saved an entire treaty from collapse in 2011. The room erupted. People turned back to Maria, their disbelief turning into awe. The story was no longer whispers, it was confirmed. Victor's stomach dropped. He had just mocked, humiliated, and publicly underestimated a woman who not only had knowledge but had connections, stretching into the highest corridors of power. Maria's eyes met his again, steady and unwavering. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to explain. The truth was powerful enough. And for Victor, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Because the crowd that once applauded his arrogance was now seeing him for what he truly was, a cruel man who mocked those he thought beneath him, only to be crushed by someone he could never hope to match. Maria had survived men like Victor before, but what no one yet knew was that her decision to speak tonight was not spontaneous. It was deliberate. She had been waiting for a moment to step back into the light, and Victor had just handed her the stage on a silver platter. The trap had been sprung, and Victor Harrington was the prey. The glittering chandeliers still cast their golden glow across the ballroom, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Where moments ago laughter and arrogance filled the air, now an unsettling silence pressed against the walls. The crowd no longer admired Victor Harrington. Instead, they watched him with sharp, judgmental eyes. His empire of intimidation had cracked, and Maria Santos stood at the fault line. Victor's jaw tightened as he scanned the room. He had been here before, cornered, doubted, challenged, but never in such a humiliating way. His reputation as a ruthless CEO had always ensured victory. He had silenced competitors with buyouts, lawsuits, or sheer intimidation. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation with numbers and contracts. This was raw human perception, and perception was everything. His wealth had bought him power, but it could not erase the words that had just been spoken. Maria Santos, the linguist who saved a treaty. The title echoed through the crowd. A maid had just been revealed as someone who once held the respect of world leaders. His attempt to ridicule her had transformed her into a legend before their very eyes. But Victor's pride was a beast that refused to die quietly. He straightened his jacket, forced a smirk, and raised his voice. So what if she once translated at the UN? Look at her now. She scrubs floors and polishes silver. That's what she is. A maid. His words, sharp and venomous, sought to reclaim control. Yet the venom had no effect. The guests, politicians, financiers, philanthropists, knew better. They had spent their lives navigating fragile egos, and they could smell desperation when it seeped from a man's pores. Victor wasn't in command. He was crumbling. And Maria. She didn't flinch. She didn't counter his words with fire. Instead, she stood in silence, her calm presence louder than any retort. The more Victor raged, the smaller he appeared. The maid he had once mocked was now a storm he could not contain. But what no one else realized, not even Victor, was that Maria had anticipated this. She hadn't simply stumbled into this confrontation. She had chosen it. For months she had lived under his roof, enduring the dismissive glances, the degrading remarks, the constant invisibility. All the while, she had watched him, studied him, learned the contours of his arrogance. She knew Victor's hunger for humiliation games, his need to showcase dominance. All she needed was a spark, and tonight, in his arrogance, he had given her one. As Victor ranted, Maria's eyes flicked toward a corner of the ballroom, where a man stood with a camera slung around his neck. He wasn't just any photographer. He worked for an international magazine that had been invited to cover the gala. Every second of Victor's meltdown, every insult, every desperate gesture, it was being recorded. And Maria knew what that meant. Tomorrow, the world would see not Victor the untouchable magnet, but Victor the bully who tried to crush a maid, only to be undone by her brilliance. The guests, sensing blood in the water, began to turn openly. Whispers became sharper, directed at Victor himself. Unbelievable. How could he speak to her like that? All these years, he's treated people like dirt. Victor's face grew red as he caught the murmurs. His empire thrived on respect, on fear, but in a matter of minutes, Maria had flipped that coin. Instead of respect, there was ridicule. Instead of fear, there was contempt. And then came the cruelest twist of all, allies abandoning him. One of Victor's closest investors, a man who had poured millions into his company, leaned back in his chair and muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "If he can't control himself in a ballroom, how can he control a boardroom?" Heads nodded. The seeds of doubt were sprouting fast. Victor's eyes darted desperately, searching for loyalty. But loyalty built on fear collapses the moment fear is gone. The crowd wasn't afraid of him anymore. They were afraid of association, with a man unraveling in public. Maria, sensing the tide fully turning, finally stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, nor did she demand applause. She simply walked past Victor, her posture tall, her steps unhurried, as though she were crossing a stage she had walked 1,000 times before. And in that moment, the symbolism was undeniable. The maid was no longer beneath him. She was above him. Victor tried to speak, to lash out again, but the words caught in his throat. The silence that followed was deafening. He realized, with growing horror, that he had lost, not just the argument, not just the night, but something far greater, his untouchable image. The jaws of Maria's trap were closing tighter, but they weren't steel jaws of revenge, they were jaws of exposure. By simply standing in her truth, by allowing Victor to reveal his own cruelty, she had orchestrated his downfall without ever striking a single blow. And yet, this was not the end. Because while the ballroom witnessed Victor's humiliation, Maria knew the real reckoning was still to come. The cameras had captured everything. Tomorrow, this story would travel far beyond the walls of Harrington Manor. Victor. Harrington's empire thrived on perception, and perception was about to turn on him with merciless speed. Maria paused at the edge of the ballroom and glanced back at Victor one last time. He was shaking, not from anger alone, but from fear. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be powerless in a room he thought he owned. And in her eyes, he saw something far more terrifying than revenge. He saw inevitability. The ballroom emptied slowly that night, but the memory of what had transpired lingered like the aftertaste of bitter wine. The chandelier still sparkled, the champagne still fizzed, and the violins still hummed their polished tunes. But no one carried the same air of admiration for Victor Harrington anymore. They left whispering, shaking their heads, some chuckling under their breath, not at his brilliance, but at his humiliation. Victor remained rooted in place, clutching his glass, the liquid trembling inside as though it sensed his unraveling. His empire had always been untouchable, shielded by wealth, power, and intimidation. But tonight, the fortress had cracked, and cracks spread faster than even the richest man could repair. The next morning, the world awoke, not to headlines of Victor's charitable gala, but to images that no amount of money could erase. The photographs flooded social media. The powerful CEO pointing a trembling finger at a maid. The maid standing tall, her eyes calm, her presence dignified. The captions wrote themselves. Victor Harrington mock his maid. Turns out she's smarter than him. The UN linguist he tried to humiliate. Wealth means nothing without respect. Hashtags blazed across platforms. Hashtag respect Maria. Hashtag made no more. Hashtag Victor exposed. Within hours, millions had seen the photos, watched the shaky phone videos, and formed their judgment. Victor Harrington was no longer the genius industrialist. He was the cruel tycoon who belittled the very people who made his life possible. And Maria. She became an icon. Not because she had delivered a fiery speech or orchestrated a dramatic revenge, but because she had done the opposite. She had stood silently, allowed truth to speak louder than words, and revealed the weakness in Victor's arrogance. The fallout came quickly. Investors pulled back. One multinational partner issued a statement, distancing themselves from Victor's company. Stock prices wavered. News anchors replayed the moment over and over, dissecting it, replaying the hush that fell over the ballroom as though it were history itself. And in a way, it was. Victor tried to salvage what he could. He hired publicists, demanded apologies be drafted, tried to spin the narrative into a misunderstanding. But every word he released sounded hollow. The world had seen too much. They had seen his sneer, his mocking laughter, his desperate rage. The internet did not forget. Behind the walls of his mansion, Victor raged like a wounded beast. He fired staff. He cursed the journalists. He threw his phone against the wall when yet another article called Maria the maid who humbled the millionaire. Each headline was a dagger, and every attempt to suppress the story only made it spread wider. But Maria, she returned quietly to her duties. She polished the silver, changed the linens, and swept the floors, just as she had the day before. Yet everything was different. No longer invisible, she was now a symbol. Other staff members looked at her with new respect. Neighbors stopped her on the street, thanking her for standing tall. Even strangers sent letters and cards, slipped into her mailbox, praising her courage. And yet, Maria herself knew the truth. It wasn't courage that had carried her that night. It was inevitability. She had known that one day, Victor's cruelty would expose itself. All she had needed was patience. The true trap had not been sprung in the ballroom. It was sprung in the days that followed, as Victor unraveled under the weight of his own pride. Weeks later, Victor attempted a public appearance. Cameras flashed as he walked onto a stage meant to showcase a new business venture. He tried to smile, to regain his old charm. But the questions cut through like knives. Mr. Harrington, have you apologized to Maria Santos? Do you believe mocking your employees reflects good leadership? Why did you belittle a UN linguist who served her country? Victor's face darkened. He tried to pivot, to speak of innovation and progress. But the crowd no longer wanted innovation. They wanted accountability. And when he stumbled off stage, sweating, humiliated once again, the final thread of his public respect snapped. Maria never asked for revenge. She never demanded an apology or money. But fate, with cruel precision, delivered justice anyway. Contracts dissolved. Partnerships ended, and one by one, Victor's allies abandoned him. The empire he had built on intimidation became a graveyard of broken deals. Meanwhile, Maria received a quiet letter one afternoon. It bore the seal of an international organization, the very same she had once served as a translator. The letter was brief, but its message was profound. They wanted her back. Her skills, her dignity, her composure under pressure. They needed voices like hers once more. Maria folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. She didn't rush to announce it, didn't post it online, didn't brag. She went back to her work, finishing the day's duties. Only later, when the sun had set, did she look out the window toward the horizon and allow herself a small, quiet smile. Quiet smile. Victor, in another wing of the estate, sat alone with his dwindling empire, consumed by bitterness. He had thought himself invincible. He had thought wealth and arrogance were armor. But Maria had shown him a truth no riches could erase. Arrogance collapses in silence. Respect, once lost, can never be bought back. And so, the man who laughed at a maid became the man the world laughed at. The final twist was simple, devastating, and poetic. Maria had not raised a voice, had not plotted elaborate revenge. She had merely stood in truth, and truth had destroyed him more thoroughly than any weapon could. The trap had closed, and in its jaws, Victor Harrington discovered the cruelest fate of all, to be remembered, not as a titan, but as a fool.